In just 3 deadly seconds under the morning light in Jacksonville, a proud black female officer was violently thrown to the ground and handcuffed in front of a bakery. Blood and tears mixed, all because of her skin color. What will become of this vicious cop? Or is there a horrifying secret about to be exposed that will make the entire nation scream? On a quiet, early morning in Jacksonville, the humid Florida air seeped through every crack in the windows, waking the city in its familiar stillness. Alana Rhodes, a proud black Air Force officer, stepped out of her Aunt Esther's small room, where the first rays of sunlight of the new day slowly streamed through the window. She wore a simple white t-shirt and well-fitted jeans, but her sneakers bore the mark of meticulous preparation and perfect routine. Her steady footsteps were never in a rush. Each step asserted the calm confidence of someone who had lived through the harshest of trials. The pride she carried needed no boast. It radiated from every feature of her face, from her sharp eyes to the small badge pinned to her chest, a symbol of a woman who had given everything for her country. She paused for a moment by the window, watching as the sky slowly brightened, feeling the tranquility of these mornings, so different from the tension-filled days back in Langley, where she worked on top-secret intelligence projects. The shadows of clouds drifted gently by, as if trying to wash away all the stress, granting her a rare moment of peace. Aunt Esther, who had raised her after her parents tragically died in a car accident when she was just a teenager, sat on the armchair in the living room. Her cloudy eyes lit up when she saw Alana preparing to leave. Every day, Aunt Esther was the only person who made Alana feel that there was still warmth in this world. She didn't want to leave her, but Alana's job required constant sacrifice and dedication. Stepping outside, Alana felt the warmth of the morning creeping into her skin, a sensation that was no stranger to her. But in this moment, it wasn't the suffocating heat of battlefields or long marches. It was the warmth of an ordinary morning in a city where she had grown up. She drove her blue SUV through the empty streets, watching as the sky shifted from gray to the pink and yellow hues of dawn. Though it was just a short trip to Aunt Esther's favorite bakery, to Alana, every moment here felt precious, for there was nothing more valuable than being able to visit family. However, she had no idea that this peaceful morning would mark the beginning of a struggle that even she couldn't yet comprehend. When she parked outside the bakery, the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air, and she smiled, embracing the familiar, peaceful feeling. But as soon as she stepped through the door, what happened next would change her life forever. Everything seemed so normal, so calm, but in just a second, everything would be torn apart. Alana stepped into the bakery with light steps, as though she were walking on the very soil of her hometown. The sweet aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, enveloping her senses. The doorbell rang, signaling the start of a new day, and Alana felt the tranquility of the morning lingering in every breath she took. She held a small paper box in her hands, filled with the freshest pastries that Aunt Esther loved the most. Warm, sweet treats that symbolized the love and dedication of a girl for the woman who had raised her over the years. It was a small, simple task, but to Alana, it held profound, sacred meaning. A soft smile spread across her face as she handed the box to the woman behind the counter, who always greeted her with a friendly gaze. "A box of pastries for my aunt," Alana said, her voice gentle yet firm, like a quiet affirmation of what she was doing. It was a small act with great significance, showing the care and love she had for Aunt Esther, the only family she had left after the great tragedy in her life. As she stepped out of the bakery, the pastry still warm in her hands, she could feel the peace and stillness that surrounded her. Despite being a woman who had faced countless harsh trials in the military, in this moment, bringing these sweet gifts to her aunt, Alana felt that every sacrifice had been worth it. It wasn't just a duty as a soldier, but as a human being, a daughter who treasured the values of family, love, and sacrifice. With the box of pastries in her hand, Alana approached her SUV, the sense of calm still lingering with every step she took, as if she were completing an important mission that no one else but her could carry out. Yet, in that moment, she had no idea that an unexpected confrontation awaited her, where every ounce of resilience and pride she held would be put to the test. The tiny Air Force badge on Alana's shirt sparkled under the morning sun, standing out against the clear sky of Jacksonville. Though it was small, it carried a deep meaning that no one could easily recognize at first glance. It wasn't just a simple piece of jewelry. It was the mark of a soldier, someone who had fought through dangerous missions at Langley, where every decision could be a matter of life and death. That badge was tied to sleepless nights, long days spent poring over data, and intense business trips to the borderlands where death was always lurking. Alana stood there facing the sunlight, but the badge on her chest didn't just reflect its bright gleam. It was a symbol of an unyielding pride. No one knew that behind her humble appearance, Alana had been a part of the U.S. Air Force's top intelligence team, where she spent years studying, fighting, and sacrificing for the goal of protecting her country. That badge didn't just represent her rank and authority. It was a testament to her challenging journey, unforgettable memories, and the resilience in every decision she made. As she walked down the empty street, her eyes filled with confidence and pride, every step Alana took affirmed one thing. No matter how harsh life got, she would remain strong. This was Alana, a proud, unyielding, and compassionate woman. She had fought not only against external enemies, but also against profound personal struggles. She knew that even in the most difficult moments, that badge would continue to shine, reminding her of everything she had sacrificed and everything she would still protect. Alana stepped out of the bakery, the small box of fresh pastry still warm in her hands, her smile lingering on her lips like a soft promise of peace. She inhaled deeply. The morning air, crisp and refreshing, filled her lungs with the calmness that only a quiet Jacksonville morning could offer. The soft rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze seemed to harmonize with the serene rhythm of the world waking up. For a brief moment, the weight of the world lifted off her shoulders, and she felt a rare sense of tranquility. Despite the intensity of her military career, despite the countless hours spent in high-stakes operations, today she felt like she was in the midst of an unspoken, perfect moment. Everything, it seemed, was in its place. It was the kind of morning you never wanted to end. But the calm was short-lived. As Alana took a few more steps, the air suddenly changed. The silence shattered, the peaceful morning broken by the harsh, commanding voice of a man. "Stop!" The shout was so sudden and violent that Alana froze, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes darted around to find the source. A tall, imposing figure emerged from the shadows, his footsteps quick and deliberate. Officer Brent Doherty, a large white man with broad shoulders, wore the uniform that seemed to swell with authority. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and calculating. His mouth twisted into a sneer that could freeze anyone's soul. The harshness in his gaze sent an unmistakable chill down her spine. Without a moment's hesitation, he closed the distance between them with an animal-like speed. His presence, like a predator closing in on its prey, was overwhelming. "You parked in the wrong spot," his voice growled, rough and full of disdain. "Step aside and explain yourself." Alana blinked, stunned for a split second. The box of pastry still clutched in her hand felt heavy, the warmth of it no longer comforting but suffocating. She was in the middle of a quiet, routine task, nothing more, nothing less. And yet, here she was, already being accused of something. She hadn't even had the chance to speak, let alone offer an explanation. "I just parked outside the bakery to grab some treats for my aunt," she said, her voice steady but carrying a hint of disbelief. Her eyes met his, trying to read the situation, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was she being targeted? Was this some kind of misunderstanding? She couldn't be sure, but she remained calm. Officer Doherty wasn't interested in explanations. "Not my problem," he snapped, his tone dripping with contempt. His words were like a slap in the face, each one more stinging than the last. "Do you think that tiny badge on your chest makes you special? You think because you're in the military, you're above everyone else? You think I'm going to let you get away with it?" His sneer deepened, his gaze turning to the small military insignia on her chest, the symbol of her service, her pride. Alana felt her blood run cold, a twinge of confusion mixed with anger rising within her. She had barely had a moment to process the situation, and yet here he was, judging her, insulting her. "I didn't mean any harm," she said again, trying to keep her voice even. "I'm just running a simple errand. I'm not causing any trouble." But he was already beyond hearing her. "You think that little piece of metal means something here?" The officer's voice was harsh, mocking. In my eyes, you're just another black woman standing here causing trouble, thinking you're entitled to special treatment. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing in disgust. You think you deserve respect just because you wore a uniform for a few years? Think again. Every word felt like a slap across her face, each insult more cutting than the last. Alana stood there, frozen in disbelief, her fingers tightening around the box in her hands as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a confrontation laced with every bit of racial prejudice she had encountered, every injustice she had fought against, now brought to her doorstep. Her hands trembled slightly as the weight of the situation hit her. Was this really happening? Was she really being treated this way? I said, give me your papers. Officer Doherty barked, his tone like an order she had no choice but to obey. There was no room for negotiation, no chance to reason with him. His mind was made up, and she was the enemy in his eyes. Alana's pride swelled in her chest, but she knew that pushing back now would only escalate things. The last thing she wanted was to make the situation worse, to make things spiral out of control. So, with a quiet, controlled motion, she reached into her wallet and pulled out her ID. But as she handed it to him, Officer Doherty didn't just take it. He snatched it from her hand as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. Military badge, huh? His voice was laced with mockery. You think you can walk around like you're better than everyone else? Like you're some kind of hero? His eyes locked onto the small badge on her chest, and in that moment, it felt like a spotlight was shining down on her. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, reduced to nothing more than a target for his hate. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time, Alana felt the sting of true humiliation. She had fought battles in war zones, risked her life countless times, earned every inch of respect she had ever been given. But in this moment, all of that meant nothing to this man, to this officer. She was nothing more than a black woman to be dismissed and belittled. You think you're special? Officer Doherty's voice was a low growl. You think wearing that uniform makes you better than anyone else? His words echoed in her mind, each syllable a punch to the gut. In my eyes, you're just a troublemaker, a black woman standing here causing a scene. You don't deserve any respect. Her world seemed to crash in on her, every word from his mouth a blow to her identity, her pride, her very soul. Alana had spent so much of her life fighting to prove she was worthy, to prove that she belonged, to show that she was more than just a statistic. But now, here she was, broken down by a man who saw none of that, who saw only the color of her skin. The badge that had once symbolized her sacrifice, her commitment, now felt like a burden. It was a cruel reminder of the world's harsh judgments, the way society had always found ways to tear her down despite everything she had achieved. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to show him that she was more than what he saw. But in that moment, all she could do was stand there, trapped in the shadows of her own history, surrounded by the weight of 1,000 injustices that had led to this moment. And for the first time in a long time, Alana felt the sting of defeat. Though Alana tried to remain calm, explaining politely that she had just bought the pastries for her aunt, Officer Brent Doherty refused to listen. She pointed to the box in her hands as a small, quiet defense, a simple gesture meant to show that she had no intention of causing trouble. But before she could finish, Officer Doherty erupted, his voice full of anger, as though he were already preparing to arrest a dangerous criminal. You're causing a disturbance. Don't pretend to be innocent. His words struck Alana like a knife, sharp and unexpected. But she held her ground, refusing to let her anger take over her reason. Doherty didn't even glance at the box of pastry she was holding. He didn't care about the reason she had parked her car. Instead, his eyes locked on her, cold and dismissive, as if she wasn't even worthy of an explanation or an opportunity to speak. Then the insults came, one after another, each word like a fresh wound that would never heal. Do you think that little military badge will protect you? Doherty mocked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Who do you think you are? A black woman standing here with the audacity to wear that uniform, thinking I should show you respect. His words were a blow to everything Alana had worked for, every sacrifice she had made. The badge, once a symbol of pride and duty, was now just another reason for his contempt. Though Alana had faced countless confrontations in her military career, nothing had prepared her for the brutal, unapologetic attack she was enduring now. Every word from Doherty wasn't just an insult to her dignity. It was a denial of all the sacrifices she had made throughout her life. She had fought to protect her country, to defend its ideals. But now, in this moment, her respect, her honor, were being trampled by racism and the ridiculous prejudices of someone she had never crossed paths with. The sense of helplessness and despair threatened to overwhelm her as she clutched the small box of pastries. It had once been a symbol of love and care for her aunt, a small token of affection, but now, in this moment, it had become the last thing she held on to in the face of a fight she never wanted, against a monster in uniform, a cop she never imagined would treat her this way. Alana swallowed hard, trying to hold her emotions in check, but every word from Doherty felt like an assault on her very soul. She felt herself shrinking under the weight of his words, as if all her accomplishments, all her sacrifices, had become meaningless in the eyes of this man. The pride she had carried for years seemed to be crumbling, reduced to dust under the sheer force of his hate. She wanted to scream, to shout that she was more than what he saw, to make him understand that her service, her honor meant more than just a badge on her chest. But all she could do was stand there, unable to fight back in the way she wanted, because in this moment, fighting back could mean losing everything. And what could she possibly say that would make a difference when this officer had already made up his mind about her? With a cruel smile, Officer Brent Doherty moved closer to Alana, his eyes filled with contempt and hostility. Alana realized in an instant that all her explanations, all her efforts to remain calm, were in vain. The officer's patience had run out, and he had made up his mind to bring her down to the lowest possible level. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming injustice she was forced to endure. She wasn't a criminal. She was a military officer, someone who had served her country. But now, all she received was humiliation. Without saying another word, Doherty yanked Alana's arm with a brutal motion, pulling her toward the patrol car. The sharp pain from the violent tug made her slightly dizzy, but she didn't resist. She knew that no matter how she reacted, the situation would only get worse. But her silence only seemed to enrage Doherty further, and he continued to escalate the humiliation she had to endure. The cold snap of the handcuffs echoed through the stillness of the parking lot, a sharp sound that cut through the air like a knife. It was the sound of confiscation, the sound of ruthless brutality without mercy. Alana's arm was forcibly cuffed, and she could feel the tightness of the metal as if it were squeezing away her freedom. The pain from her wrist being bound tightly didn't even compare to the pain in her heart, the pain of being degraded, the pain of someone stripping away her dignity. Doherty stood there smirking, his malicious gaze fixed on her. "You think that badge can protect you?" he sneered. "You think I can't do anything to you?" His words were dripping with venom, and the smile on his face twisted into something sinister, as if he were enjoying the sight of a former soldier, a woman who had given everything for her country, now bound and humiliated before him. The cold handcuffs, the merciless cruelty in his actions, made Alana feel as though she were being pushed into an inescapable abyss. But she refused to let herself fall. Even with her hands cuffed and her dignity torn apart, she stood tall. She refused to let someone like Doherty break the pride she had forged over years of service. She wasn't weak, and while injustice could hurt her, it would never make her fall. Doherty had no idea that in that moment, he was doing the exact opposite of what he intended. By trying to break her, he had made Alana stronger than ever. He could cuff her hands, but he could never cuff her spirit. The small bag of pastries that Alana had been holding fell to the ground with a harsh, dry thud. The sweet treats, carefully chosen with love and thought for her Aunt Esther, now lay broken and crushed beneath the feet of Officer Brent Doherty. The pastries scattered across the ground, shattered into pieces, as if all of Alana's hope had crumbled along with them. There was no apology, no hint of sympathy. The officer simply stood there, looking down at the fragments with a sense of satisfaction, as if this act was a declaration of his power, his dominance over her. Alana couldn't contain the surge of anger rising in her chest. She took a deep breath, struggling to steady her voice, but the lump in her throat betrayed her. Her eyes began to redden, and the tears she had been holding back all this time now flowed freely down her cheeks. They were tears of regret, of an indescribable pain, a wound that was far deeper than any physical hurt. She thought of Aunt Esther, the woman who had raised her when she was a young orphan, who had always been there whenever she needed her. Aunt Esther had been waiting for her to come home with her favorite pastries, but now Alana had nothing to bring back. Everything, every small effort she had made to bring some joy to her aunt, had been ripped away in a single moment. The pastries were no longer just simple gifts. They had become symbols of love and sacrifice, now crushed beneath the foot of a heartless cop. In that moment, the humiliation was unbearable. Alana felt like an animal being hunted, not treated as a human being but as an object, something worthless, undeserving of respect. Each tear that fell from her eyes was not only a reflection of the injustice she was enduring, but also an expression of her deep-seated fury toward a man who had abused his power to hurt her. But Alana knew she couldn't let this end like this. She looked down at the shattered pieces of the pastry, then back at Officer Doherty. The fury inside her intensified, stronger than ever. But instead of reacting impulsively, she maintained an absolute calm. This was not the time to lose control. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for those who couldn't speak up, for those who had been stripped of everything just because of their skin color and the societal injustices that plagued them. Despite the humiliation, despite the excruciating pain, Alana took another deep breath and whispered to herself, "I will never let him win." As Officer Brent Doherty continued to aggressively push Alana down onto the patrol car, the air around them grew thick and cold. The onlookers stood frozen, but not a single one dared to speak out. Some turned away, avoiding Alana's furious gaze, while others whispered among themselves. But no one intervened. No one stepped forward to stop the injustice unfolding right before their eyes. The crowd, though present, was like lifeless shadows, paralyzed by the suffering of another. Doherty pressed his knee harder into Alana's back, as if to crush her completely, making sure she couldn't fight back. Her hands were cuffed tightly, but the pain from the scratches on her skin still tormented her, an unrelenting reminder of the violence she was enduring. Alana's black hair fell loosely, scattering across the asphalt, mingling with the tears she couldn't control. Blood from the wounds on her hands dripped, staining the ground with small red drops, merging with her silent tears, creating streaks of crimson on the concrete. Each drop of blood seemed to serve as a grim reminder of the injustice she was suffering. Each wound, each drop of blood etched deeper into her soul, a pain not only from the physical attack, but also from the violation of her dignity. But what hurt the most was the silence of the crowd. They stood there watching a woman being treated like a criminal, yet none of them had the courage to speak out, to defend what was right. In that moment, Alana felt isolated, as though she had become an outsider, no longer part of the society she had spent her entire life defending. These people, the ones who stood by and watched, had relinquished their power to protect the truth. Their indifference was like a blade piercing her heart, making her feel that she was not only being disrespected by the officer, but also by the silence of those around her. The blood and tears mingled, and Alana felt a deep, overwhelming loneliness. But in that moment, despite the silence, she sensed an inner strength rising within her. She was not someone who could be defeated. Though this humiliation and injustice could hurt her, they could never break her. The apathy of those around her would never strip away her pride or her determination to fight for what was right. After being escorted into the police station, Alana was locked into a dark, empty holding cell. The heavy clang of the iron door slamming shut sounded like the final severing of her freedom. The dim lights on the ceiling cast a faint, feeble glow, barely illuminating the cold, sterile space. Shadows danced on the walls, turning the room into a haunting, silent prison with no escape in sight. She had no phone, no contact with the outside world. Everything seemed to be cut off, leaving her alone in the darkness, consumed by the endless loop of thoughts about what had just transpired. The sound of footsteps faded away, and Alana lay flat on the cold metal bed, but sleep eluded her. Her wrists, still shackled, throbbed with pain, and her body was tense in the cramped space. The wounds on her hands continued to seep blood, each drop a reminder of the humiliation she had just endured. But the physical pain wasn't the only thing tormenting her now. In that moment, she felt as though she had been stripped of everything: her dignity, her freedom, and any semblance of justice. Her mind echoed with a question she couldn't escape. Who am I to deserve this brutality? Every time she asked herself that, an overwhelming sense of anger swelled in her chest. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a villain. She was a military officer, someone who had dedicated her life to defending the values her country claimed to uphold. But now, all of that seemed to mean nothing in the eyes of those in power. She felt defeated, not by an external enemy, but by the very system she had served. Blood and tears, once symbols of pain and injury, had now become symbols of the anguish of an oppressed nation, of people whose voices were silenced in a society where racial discrimination still festered like a silent cancer, slowly eroding every part of it. Alana knew she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who couldn't speak out, for those who had been overlooked and disregarded simply because of their skin color. She turned over, trying to breathe evenly despite the weight of the exhaustion pressing down on her. Her body was tired, but her spirit refused to yield. The physical pain would fade, but the resilience inside her would never go out. No matter how the world turned, no matter how she was treated, there was one thing she knew for sure: she would never give up. The long night dragged on in a feverish haze. Alana curled up on the cold metal bed, but sleep eluded her. The physical pain still clung to her like an unshakable shadow, but what bothered her most was the isolation, the suffocating feeling of being trapped in that dim, oppressive space. It felt as if the entire world had turned its back on her. No phone, no contact with the outside. Alana felt like a stranger in her own country, the country she had sacrificed so much for. The questions twisted in her mind, relentless and painful. Why do I have to endure this? What did I do wrong? But then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, there came a noise from outside her cell door. The door creaked open, and in that moment, Marcus Whitfield, Alana's cousin, the one person she had always trusted, stepped inside. Marcus, a brilliant civil rights lawyer who had dedicated his life to fighting for the oppressed and the unjustly treated, was her light in the darkness. Marcus didn't speak right away. He simply stood there for a moment, his eyes full of concern and love as he took in her condition. Then he stepped closer to the bars, reached through the gap, and gently took Alana's hand. The warmth of his touch was like a lifeline, providing her with a sense of strength and comfort that she desperately needed. This was the moment Alana had longed for: a hand to hold, a comfort, and above all, a resilience only a loved one could provide. "You're a warrior, Alana," Marcus said, his voice firm but filled with compassion. "We'll make him pay for this. Don't let this humiliation defeat you. You fought on the battlefield, and now you'll fight in this courtroom. I'll help you." Marcus's words were like a fresh breeze that blew through Alana's mind, awakening something deep inside her. She could feel the pride she had almost forgotten slowly reigniting within her. Despite all the pain and injustice she had endured, in this moment, she realized the fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for those who couldn't speak, for justice, and for all the victims of racial discrimination. Marcus continued, his gaze locked on hers, unwavering and resolute. "We will turn over every stone, uncover the truth, and bring justice back. Brent Doherty will pay for what he's done. You're not alone in this fight, Alana. I'm here with you, and we won't let this injustice go unchallenged." Marcus's words were not just comfort. They were a pledge, a strength that Alana could hold on to as she faced the battle ahead. She could feel her own power rising again. This was not the time to fall. This was the time to find herself once more, and she would not let anyone degrade her dignity. Not now, not ever. With that firm grip, Alana knew she had a powerful ally by her side. The upcoming legal battle would be a fight for truth and justice, and she would let no one, least of all Doherty, stand in her way. Alana stood before the small, grimy mirror in the jailhouse bathroom, her hands trembling as she wiped away the last of the tears that still clung to her cheeks. She had cried enough. Those tears, though they might offer a brief moment of relief, could never change the truth. Her pain wasn't just physical. It was the humiliation, the deep wound of being wronged by those who couldn't understand the meaning of pride. But now she understood that everything had a purpose, and her fight had never truly ended. Standing tall before the mirror, Alana stared at her reflection. She was no longer the weak girl who had been shackled and humiliated. She was a soldier, a warrior who had faced countless challenges, and she would not let this injustice defeat her. The small Air Force badge, once a part of her, now became a weapon in her mind, not for boasting, not for pride, but to remind herself that she was born to fight. Whether on the battlefield with dangerous missions at stake or in the courtroom where truth and justice would be tested, she was always ready to rise. She placed her hand over the badge on her chest, feeling it as a solid anchor, a reminder of why she had chosen this path. It wasn't an easy path, but it was the right one, the path that people like her had to walk to protect the values she believed in. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who had been mistreated because of their skin color, their background, or things they had no control over. Alana looked at herself in the mirror once more, no longer seeing the image of someone defeated, but the image of a resilient warrior preparing for the most important battle of her life. She knew that the upcoming trial wouldn't be easy. They would try to defeat her with lies, with fabricated evidence, but she wouldn't let them succeed. She would stand strong, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been oppressed, cast aside, and dismissed by the biases of society. She took her suit jacket, slid it on, and adjusted the Air Force badge on her chest, as if making a silent vow. Today was not a day for tears, it was a day for fighting. She knew this battle would be hard, but she was unafraid. Alana Rhodes was ready to face whatever came her way. Alana stood motionless before the mirror, her eyes fixed on her own reflection. In the quiet of the small room, she could feel each breath she took, each fragment of pain shattering in her heart. But none of it had the power to break her. She had endured too many trials in her life, and now she understood that every wound, every drop of blood, every tear shed was not meant to bring her down. It was meant to forge her strength. He may have taken my blood and tears, but he will never take my pride, Alana whispered to herself, her lips pressed together, her eyes cold and resolute. That was the silent vow she made to herself. Blood and tears could be washed away, but her pride, her dignity, and her self-respect would never be stolen. Even after the humiliation and brutality, even if the handcuffs squeezed her to the point of suffocation, the core of who she was remained. She was a warrior, a soldier who would never give up. She touched the Air Force badge, the symbol she had carried with her through all these years, not for boasting, but because it represented everything she had sacrificed. As a soldier, she had lived for a purpose greater than herself, and today she would continue to fight for that purpose, not just for herself, but for those who couldn't speak out. Turning away from the mirror, she stood straight, adjusting her outfit. Every step she took, every movement she made, exuded a steadfast resilience that could not be shaken. This was the turning point, the moment when she was ready to face the beast, to confront the injustice he had caused. No more fear, no more doubt. Alana Rhodes was ready. She would not allow him or anyone else to crush her pride any longer. She was a warrior, and she would fight to the end. The courtroom was heavy with tension, an oppressive silence filling the air as Officer Brent Doherty made his way to the witness stand. His every movement was deliberate, his posture tall and arrogant, as if he were already the victor, not someone being scrutinized under the weight of his own lies. As he stepped up to testify, the room seemed to tighten, and the energy in the air grew thick. Everyone knew this was the crucial moment, the moment that would decide the fate of Alana's fight. But as the officer began his testimony, it became evident that the truth would not be his ally. Instead, what he was about to deliver was a stream of falsehoods, expertly crafted to justify the brutality he had inflicted. Doherty stood there, his chest puffed out with a sense of entitlement, his eyes sweeping across the room as if he expected applause. He wasn't addressing the jury or the judge. It was as if he were speaking to an audience that already knew the outcome of his story. He glanced at the judge, who gave no outward reaction, and then turned his gaze to the jury, his eyes flashing with an almost predatory gleam. "She was rude, threatening me," he began, his voice oozing with self-righteousness. "She refused to follow my orders. I asked her for her identification, and instead of cooperating, She insulted me, resisting my commands. Doherty paused, his smile curling with arrogance. He reveled in the control he seemed to possess, looking down at Alana with a mixture of disdain and smug satisfaction. "I'm just a police officer doing my job," he continued, his tone dripping with fabricated sincerity. "I didn't do anything wrong." She escalated the situation. I tried to handle it peacefully, but she was uncooperative. She just stood there mocking me, refusing to listen. What choice did I have but to apply the necessary force? His voice carried the weight of someone who had convinced himself his actions were justified, as if his position alone could erase the violence he had inflicted. As he spoke, his words began to weave a story, a version of events that was as distorted as it was dishonest. Doherty made himself the hero of the tale, painting a picture of a calm officer simply doing his duty, only to be provoked by an unruly suspect. The jury, the judge, and everyone present were sucked into his carefully crafted narrative, unaware of the venomous lies he was feeding them. Each word from his mouth seemed more convincing than the last, as if he had rehearsed them in his mind 1,000 times, knowing exactly how to manipulate the story to his favor. Alana sat in the defendant's chair, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and fury as she listened to the lies spilled from Doherty's mouth. Every word felt like a slap in the face, each sentence a deliberate attack on her integrity. Her hands clenched into fists, but she forced herself to remain still. She knew that letting her emotions control her now would only play into his hands. His lies painted her as the villain, a criminal who deserved what had happened. But she was none of those things. She wasn't rude. She wasn't threatening. She was a woman who had been doing nothing more than living her life and trying to take care of her aunt. And yet, here she was, being portrayed as the enemy. Doherty continued, unfazed by the growing tension in the room. "I did everything by the book," he said, his voice now dripping with mock sincerity. "I was calm, respectful, but she just kept pushing back. She made it impossible for me to do my job. And when she wouldn't comply, I had no choice but to take action. I mean, I'm a police officer. What else could I do?" His words twisted the entire situation. The officer who had shoved her into the car, who had degraded her in front of an indifferent crowd, was now the victim. Alana's heart raced as she realized that his calculated lies could easily turn the tide in his favor if they weren't challenged. She could feel the weight of the room's judgment shifting, the tension mounting as Doherty's words echoed throughout the courtroom. But Alana knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless people who had suffered in silence, whose stories had been buried by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. She couldn't allow this lie to stand, this distortion of the truth that would silence her and so many others. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, knowing that the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning of the battle for justice. In that moment, Alana's gaze locked onto Doherty. She could see his confidence, his belief that he had already won. But what he didn't know was that his lies had awakened something within her, a fire that would burn brighter than ever. The injustice that had been done to her would not go unchallenged. The truth would be revealed, and the world would see him for who he truly was. As she looked around the courtroom, Alana steeled herself for what was to come. She would stand strong. She would fight back with everything she had. This trial would not be won by lies. It would be won by truth, and she was ready to make sure that truth was heard. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick with tension as Marcus Whitfield stood up, his gaze filled with determination and confidence. It was time to bring the truth to light. He looked directly at the judge, then turned to the jury, offering a subtle, challenging smile. The entire room fell silent, waiting for the decisive blow that Marcus was about to strike. "Your Honor, I request that a video be entered as evidence," Marcus said clearly, his voice neither rushed nor soft, but with the weight of authority. "This is a video from the security camera of the bakery where the incident occurred. It will prove everything that happened in the parking lot." The large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, and all eyes turned toward it. The video from the bakery security camera appeared. The first frame showed Alana calmly walking out of the bakery with the box of pastries in her hands. She was composed and polite, showing no signs of confrontation or hostility. She glanced up and saw Officer Brent Doherty approaching, his eyes already filled with animosity from the moment he saw her. Alana wasn't rude or threatening. On the contrary, she attempted to explain herself gently, gesturing to the box of pastries as a reason for her parking there. But then the video cut to the next scene. Doherty's demeanor had changed, becoming aggressive and hostile. He was shouting at Alana, pointing at her with a harsh, cold tone that lacked any trace of professional conduct. He stood far too close to her, his face red with rage, demanding her ID without any reasonable explanation. Even when Alana calmly responded, trying to de-escalate the situation, he completely lost control, abusing his authority without justification. A murmur began to ripple through the courtroom. People were starting to realize the truth, slowly understanding that everything had been twisted and Doherty's actions were utterly unjustifiable. The video continued to show Alana calmly handing over her ID, offering no resistance, while Doherty remained in her face, still yelling and insulting her. His words before he pushed her down and cuffed her now seemed meaningless, nothing but a poor cover for the brutality of his actions. The eyes of the jury lit up, and skeptical glances began to shift toward Doherty. No one in the room could deny the truth now. The footage spoke for itself. Alana hadn't acted aggressively, nor had she resisted. Instead, she had faced a police officer using his power with cruelty and hatred. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, as if the entire world had stopped for that moment. The brutality of Doherty's actions was now irrefutable. His testimony had been exposed for the lie it was, and a single question began to weigh heavily on the minds of everyone present. How could someone who represents the law behave this way? The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted after the video. The tension and outrage that had filled the room were now replaced with a palpable sense of disbelief. Brent Doherty, the officer who had once believed he held absolute power, now stood exposed, as if stripped of his false armor. His words, the fabricated lies he had so carefully constructed, now lay in tatters, meaningless in the face of the undeniable truth. The room was silent, as if no one dared to breathe. All eyes now fixed on Alana, who stood tall, more resolute than ever. She stood up calmly, without hesitation or fear. Her hands were steady, the Air Force badge still proudly pinned to her chest. Alana turned to face the judge, then looked toward the jury. Her voice was strong and unwavering. "I am Captain Alana Rhodes, U.S. Air Force intelligence officer," she declared, each word echoing with pride and dignity. These weren't just words of identification. They were a proclamation of her strength and resilience, the declaration of a woman who had fought not only on the battlefield but in the war for justice. Each word from Alana was a shockwave, a piercing light cutting through the darkness. The courtroom fell silent, a stunned hush sweeping through the room. Alana, the woman whom Doherty had tried to turn into a criminal, was no longer just a soldier. She was a symbol of strength, pride, and dignity that could not be crushed. The entire room was still. No one dared to move. The eyes of the jury lit up as if suddenly realizing a deeper truth. The people present, from the lawyers to the judge, now understood that they were not just listening to a woman, but to a warrior, someone who had dedicated her life to protecting justice, not just for herself, but for all those who had been wronged. Doherty stood there, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. He had underestimated her, thinking that she would be an easy target, someone he could break and humiliate. But now he was facing a woman who fought with a power greater than his own. His brutality was no longer just an act of injustice. It had become an indelible stain in the eyes of everyone in that courtroom. Alana stood firm, unafraid. She had not only fought for herself, but for all those who had been oppressed, silenced, and cast aside because of their skin color or the prejudices imposed by society. She was a warrior, and now she had used her identity and her strength to make it clear that Doherty's cruelty would never be allowed to stand. This was her moment, a moment where her true identity, her true purpose, could not be denied. The man who thought he could break her had only awakened a force that would not be easily extinguished. The courtroom witnessed not just the unraveling of a lie, but the undeniable rise of a woman who would stop at nothing to ensure justice prevailed. The courtroom fell into an absolute silence as Judge Sarah Morton stood up, holding the verdict in her hand. The entire room froze, every gaze locked on her. Everyone knew this moment would decide everything. They had all witnessed the brutality of Officer Brent Doherty, and the irrefutable evidence displayed through the video from the bakery. And now, justice was about to be served. Judge Morton looked down at the verdict, then turned her gaze to Alana, her eyes filled with respect. Based on the evidence presented, I find Alana Rhodes not guilty, she announced, her voice calm yet powerful. Each word she spoke felt like an explosion in the air, breaking apart all the lies Doherty had tried to conceal. Furthermore, she continued, I order an investigation into Officer Brent Doherty for abuse of power and for his false testimony. We will not allow this brutality to continue. As the verdict was announced, a wave of applause erupted in the courtroom. Those present couldn't help but break into applause. The jury clapped, and Alana's supporters couldn't hold back their excitement. After all the suffering, after months of relentless fighting, justice had finally been delivered. However, in stark contrast to the celebration around her, Alana couldn't stop the tears from flowing. These were not tears of pain, nor were they tears of the hurt she had endured. They were tears of hope, of liberation. She had fought not just for herself, but for all those who had been oppressed, treated unfairly because of their race, their gender, or any other unjust reason. And now, her tears were a symbol of justice fulfilled. She stood there amidst the thunderous applause, but in her heart, she felt that her tears were not a sign of defeat, but of the victory of dignity and pride. This was the victory of someone who had never given up, someone who had always believed in justice, even when facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. Judge Morton smiled softly, her eyes filled with respect and empathy for Alana. Justice has prevailed, she said quietly. And in that moment, Alana knew that it wasn't just her, but all those who had been ostracized, all those who had been mistreated, could finally breathe easy. Justice had been served, and though the road ahead might still be long, Alana knew that hope was still alive. After the bombshell ruling in the courtroom, public opinion erupted like a wildfire, uncontrollable and fierce. News of Alana's case spread quickly across all media platforms, from traditional outlets to social media, where people began to question the power structures and injustices they had been enduring. Those who had been oppressed, those who had been victimized by Officer Brent Doherty's abuse of power, could no longer remain silent. One by one, they stood up, exposing the brutal acts Doherty had committed in the past. A series of horrifying stories came to light. One man described being beaten by Doherty during a traffic stop over a minor infraction. Another woman spoke about how Doherty humiliated her for not understanding English simply while she tried to explain a minor traffic accident. These testimonies poured out, each one further exposing the brutality and arrogance of this officer. People began to realize that Doherty wasn't just an isolated case of a rogue cop, but part of a broader system where cruelty was allowed to flourish unchecked and unaccountable. The public condemnation was swift and fierce. Civil rights organizations, activist groups, and even everyday citizens all rallied behind Alana, demanding that the authorities take action. The stories about Doherty were no longer just a single incident, but a clear example of the corruption within a portion of the police force. Calls for reform and systemic change in law enforcement grew louder than ever before. Weeks later, Doherty was placed on administrative leave and eventually fired. The decision was a significant blow to his career, but that was far from the end. Investigations into his actions continued, and the evidence of his violent behavior over the years only grew clearer. Ultimately, he was charged with criminal offenses for abuse of power, falsifying reports, and the wrongful use of force. Justice was not only being served for Alana, but for all the victims who had suffered at his hands. Alana's blood and tears, though born of immense pain, became the fire that consumed the evil. Her resilience had sparked the torch of justice, and it spread, burning brighter and fiercer, wiping out not just Doherty, but the systems and people that had long shielded the injustice. Alana knew that she had fought not just for herself, but for a much greater cause, a movement that would bring about significant change, a turning point in the fight for justice, and for all those who had been marginalized and neglected by society. Doherty stood there, his towering figure now seeming small and defeated under the furious gaze of everyone in the courtroom. His messy hair and confused eyes no longer carried the smugness and confidence they once did. He lowered his head, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes, and took slow, heavy steps as he made his way out of the courtroom, like a man who had been exposed and completely crushed by justice. As he tried to leave quietly, whispers began to ripple through the room. The utter outrage of the audience could no longer be concealed. Every gaze was fixed on him, filled with hatred and unforgiving contempt. "He deserves worse than this," a voice rang out from the back of the room, full of raw anger and fury. It was not just a casual remark, but the collective voice of everyone who had witnessed the brutality Doherty had inflicted. They had seen it in the videos, heard the testimonies of the victims, and now they understood that the punishment Doherty was receiving was far too light compared to the atrocities he had committed. The emotional intensity in the courtroom reached its peak as everyone present became fully aware of the injustice that a police officer like Doherty had caused, not just to Alana, but to countless other innocent people. He had not only abused his power, but had used it as a tool to crush the dignity of the vulnerable, those who had no means to fight back. But now, the fury of justice had exposed everything. There was no room for forgiveness for someone like him. Each of Doherty's steps seemed to weigh heavier than the last, as if he were carrying the weight of all his sins on his shoulders. He knew that there was no escape, no further denial. His punishment was not just legal, it was the loss of the dignity and honor he had once thought he was entitled to. But in that moment, Alana's gaze, strong and proud, never left Doherty. She knew that the punishment he would face was necessary, but her anger didn't stop there. The price Doherty had to pay, though it served as a harsh lesson, could never make up for the damage he had caused. No matter what, the pain he had left behind could never be erased. But at least justice had been served. The courtroom remained filled with anger and a sense of injustice, but also with hope. Hope that this would be a significant step toward changing the system, that this would not be an isolated story, but the beginning of powerful changes so that no one would ever have to endure this kind of injustice again. Alana returned to the cozy home of her Aunt Esther, carrying a new bag of pastries, but her heart was no longer light as it once was. Though the pastries had been carefully chosen, they no longer brought her the same sense of peace. She placed the bag down on the table and sat beside her aunt, but the pain that lingered within her still hadn't faded. "I don't want anyone to bleed and cry like I did," she said, her voice sinking, the words wrapping around her heart like an unbreakable thread. Alana didn't want to see it as a victory, because she knew the cost of justice could sometimes be too great. Her blood and tears had sparked a change, but what she had to endure to achieve that justice was not something she wished for anyone else. Aunt Esther looked at her with eyes that, though worn with age, shone with empathy. "You did the right thing. You didn't bear that burden alone. You've opened the path for others. They will never forget." Alana nodded, feeling the strength within her. Her pride was no longer just a symbol for herself, but a beacon for those oppressed. People like her, with no voice, no power, would find strength in the justice she had fought for. As time passed, the U.S. Air Force promoted Alana, acknowledging her courage not only on the battlefield, but in the fight against injustice in her own country. She was assigned a higher position, a more important role where she didn't just fight for the security of the nation, but also for equality, justice, and the rights of all its citizens. Alana continued her service with a heart prouder than ever. Every day, she worked not only because it was her duty, but because of the mission she had chosen, to protect the values she believed in, not just from external threats, but within the society she called home. Every action she took carried a greater responsibility than ever before. Her pride no longer came from the badge on her chest, but from what she had done and would continue to do for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She looked toward the bright light ahead, clearly seeing that the path to continue fighting was still open. The battle wasn't over, but she knew she would never stand alone. She had allies, people who understood and shared this mission with her, people who were ready to rise when injustice threatened. Alana stood before a crowd at a community forum where all eyes were fixed on her. She had spoken many times about change, about justice, but today she wanted to leave a question that would resonate deeply in the minds of everyone present. Looking directly at the audience, she spoke with a strong voice, yet one tinged with pain. "My blood and tears have changed the story. What will you do to stop the next act of brutality?" She didn't need to say anything more. That question alone sparked action in every person present. It wasn't just a call to act. It was a reminder that change doesn't come from a single individual, but from the collective strength of the people. The room fell silent, and the eyes of the audience lit up, feeling the strength and truth in her words. Those who had stood silent, those who had only witnessed the injustice, now realized they too could do something. They could change, and they had to act. Alana was no longer just a soldier. She was the flame, and that flame would continue to burn, lighting the way for those ready to fight for justice. With a proud smile, Alana stepped down from the podium, not with victory in her hands, but with the mission that still burned brightly in her heart. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but the pride in her would always be the beacon guiding the way. Thank you to everyone who has joined me on this journey. Your support and belief in justice have been invaluable. The fight for justice is far from over, and we must keep pushing forward. Together, we can create change. If this story has inspired you, don't wait for others to act. Be the change. Stand up for what's right. Speak out against injustice. And remember that every action counts. Let's continue to fight for equality and dignity. What will you do to stop the next act of brutality? The time to act is now. Let's make a difference together.